Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
No, go past this part. In fact, never play this again.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, joined by Chad Gross.
How's it going, Brian?
It's going good. We just finished our final themed dinner this week. There are 5 in our family, so and there's this TV show over here called Come Dine With Me. Basically, a bunch of people get together and they take 5 nights out of the week and they eat at each other's house and cook themed dinners. And it's pretty interesting and lame and funny at the same time. And so, we all had different themes, and Ruby finished her dinner this evening, which probably conquered pretty well as far as they went.
You think that might have been the best one, Ruby's?
Yeah. It was the tastiest, you know. She had a carnival theme, like a circus carnival theme. So there was homemade kind of corn dogs that were like yummy. And
Were there any clowns there?
Well, Eva had clown face paint and colorful attire. Carl had a wig on with a mohawk wig and a sword.
Very nice.
So,
well, your theme, I think, was Lord of the Rings. Am I correct?
That's right. Yes.
That menu that you sent me was most impressive. It made me want to hop on a plane and fly over and join.
Yeah. Well, the rib of orc was a little dry. There was venison sausages, Aragorn's venison sausages. Those were yummy.
Yes.
The Sam's coney with taters precious. I had never cooked rabbit before, and it was, I don't think I'll cook it again. I mean, it was fun, but it didn't taste as good as Ruby's. All my stuff was experimental, you know?
Right.
So we had funnel cakes and candy apples tonight and played carnival games and everything. So it was good fun.
That sounds like a lot of fun, man.
Yeah.
That's good family time right there.
Well, speaking of toxic things you can eat, today we're talking about something else toxic. A book we've been reading that has recently come out by Professor Nancy Pearcey, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Really great book. So if you're not familiar with Nancy Pearcey, have you read some of her books, Chad?
I have not read them from cover to cover, but I have visited them as a resource. And also my kids are in classical conversations, and her book, Total Truth, is one of the books in their curriculum.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the toxic war on masculinity. Nancy R. Pearcey explains how secularism has villainized the concept of masculinity. There's like 3 parts to the book, but the toxic war on masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, reveals the surprising answers to questions such as, where did the idea come from that masculinity is toxic? What impact did secularism have on the script for masculinity? How do Christian men shatter the negative stereotypes?
I was actually really surprised I expected to read it and obviously to be challenged by the current kind of secular narrative of what it means to be a man and what it means to be masculine and things like that, and the feminization of men. I expected those things to be in there, but what I didn't expect to be in there were all the helpful bits about how to be a man in a marriage and to honor Christ in your marriage, to learn about why marriages fail, and also to kind of coach me through thinking about how I can respond to my wife better to cultivate a better relationship. And so those were some nuggets in there that I did not expect to find, but that I found very helpful and gave me a lot to think about. Yeah,
definitely good stuff in there that has application for parenting and what does it mean to be a man in the household, leading your family or, raising kids.
I also appreciated her being willing to challenge, as I said, current cultural narratives about, are Christian men the most abusive? Do they get divorced the most often? I mean, these are some of the things we hear, and the data that she presents actually proves otherwise. And there are some important distinctions that need to be made when you're making those claims. And so I hope to get into some of those today when we talk to her. And also, it was really interesting to learn that she was a student of Francis Schaeffer. and that she also came to Christ through the study of apologetics. That was instrumental. So once again, it challenges that often heard narrative that you hear that, oh, you can't argue somebody into the faith. Well, as Lee Strobel says, he meets people all the time who came to be Christians through arguments. So the Holy Spirit can use arguments.
Nancy Pearcey's latest book is The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. Her earlier books include Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and 2 ECPA Gold Medallion Award winners, How Now Shall We Live, and Total Truth. Her books have been translated into 19 languages. She's professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's a former agnostic, and Pearcey has spoken at universities such as Princeton, Stanford, USC, and Dartmouth. She's been quoted in the New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. That's quite a title, but looking forward to meeting and speaking with Professor Nancy Pearcey. Let's get ready for the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Well, Professor Nancy Pearcey, thanks for joining us for the interview.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we've read your book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. And I didn't really know what to expect from this book, but I was pleasantly surprised at how it came from so many different angles with so many different insights, history and philosophy and an apologetic for true non-toxic masculinity. It was very enjoyable, so we're excited to talk to you about it.
Thanks so much.
I was very intrigued by the way that you started the book, talking about your own experience with your father. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit and talk about why you thought it was important to start the book that way.
Yes, I do start with an introduction. My own childhood was very abusive. My father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. And in fact, he liked to make a knuckle fist, with the middle finger extended slightly to make a sharper stab of pain. So I put that at the front, partly because I wanted to say, well, and I do say in the introduction, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life, right? Because my whole life I've had to work through healing from the trauma of my childhood. I've had to work through to what is a healthy, positive, biblical view of masculinity. And I was interviewed by a Christian psychologist, and he said, well, we know you're not writing from some ivory tower, because of your story, you're writing from the trenches. And it's not like you've grown up in a privileged, loving home where you never really had to wrestle with these things. I've had to personally wrestle with them very deeply. And as you might imagine, when I became a young adult, I immediately ricocheted off into extreme feminism for many years. And so I've been on that side of the fence as well, and then had to decide why I'm not going to identify as a feminist anymore, and because I don't want that hostile perspective that's often associated with feminism. As long as we're into it already, I'll tell you when I stopped being a feminist. It was a particular time. I can tell you the exact day. I was always reading some feminist book, all the classics, Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, and Kate Millett. And I was reading Nancy Friday, and she has a book called My Mother, Myself. And it's all about how if you have problem X, it's because of what your mother did. And if you have problem Y, it's because of what your mother did. And if you have Z, it's, your mother.
So everything's mom's fault. I got it.
Kind of Freudian, right?
Yes, indeed.
And I remember at one point thinking, she's not giving any solutions. And I thought, I'm tired of being a victim. That's exactly the thought that went through my mind. I'm tired of being a victim. I slammed the book shut. And that's the day I stopped calling myself a feminist. So I've been sort of on both sides of this debate in my own personal life.
Wow, that's helpful. So part of your healing process that you mentioned has to do, I think listeners would find this interesting, had to do with Francis Schaeffer. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I have talked about my conversion before in other books because I did give up my faith. I was raised Lutheran. I don't know if you know this, but Lutherans, well, all Scandinavians are Lutheran. It's an ethnic thing.
I didn't know that.
Just like all Irish are Catholic. Yeah, all Scandinavians are Lutheran. And so my dad's Swedish, my mom's Norwegian, so, what else can we be? But part of the weakness of an ethnic faith like this is that the parents often rely on the ethnic identity to hold their children. as opposed to a really firm, personal, vivid faith. And so when I was in high school, I started just asking, how do we know Christianity is true? I'm attending a public high school. All my teachers are secular. All my textbooks are secular. And I just started asking, how do we know Christianity is true? And since I mentioned my father, I'll let you know that I asked my father one time, point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me. That's it.
Wow.
Yike.
And I had a chance to talk to a Lutheran seminary dean. It was my uncle. And I thought I would get something more substantial from a seminary dean, but he said, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes, as if it were a psychological phase that I would outgrow. And so that's when I decided, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And I felt like it was a matter of intellectual honesty to say, if I don't have good reasons for being a Christian, then I shouldn't be one. I shouldn't say I'm a Christian. And so I very intentionally walked away at about age 16 or so. And that's how I got into philosophy, because I started walking down the hallway, the public high school I attended, and pulling books off the philosophy shelf, because I thought, if I can't get any adults to talk to me about these issues, maybe that's, these dead guys, right? These dead white guys, because that's their job, right? Their job is they're supposed to ask questions like, what is truth? How do we know it? What's the meaning of life? Is there a foundation for ethics, or is it just true for me, true for you? And I pretty quickly realized that if there was no God, the answer was no to all of those. There is no meaning to life, that we're just on a rock flying through empty space. And there's not even a foundation for knowledge. Here's how I thought about it. I thought, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time, space, and history, what makes me think I could have any sort of universal, overarching, absolute truth? Ridiculous. That's how I thought of it. Ridiculous. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had embraced many secular isms, moral relativism, skepticism, and even determinism, because from my science classes, I learned that we were just complex biochemical machines anyway. So I was thoroughly immersed in secular thinking. And it was a few years later, I had gone back to Europe. My father had worked in Europe when I was a child, and so I saved my money all through high school because I loved it, and I wanted to go back, and I did. And that's how I sort of stumbled across L'Abri. And that was the first time I had encountered apologetics. I encountered Christians who could actually engage with the secular philosophies that I had absorbed by that time. By the way, existentialism was the big thing right then in Europe. So all my German friends, I lived in Germany, all my German friends were totally into Camus and Sartre.
Oh, boy.
And so I was very impressed, because L'Abri was the first time I had encountered Christians who could engage those isms and could show that Christianity had better answers. And it was incredibly impressive. And it is the main reason that I came back to Christianity. That part of my story I've told before, but the part that I haven't is the one that you just asked about, Chan. And that is, on staff at L'Abri was a psychiatric social worker. And she was there because she realized that for a lot of young people, their objections are not just intellectual, but also emotional, especially in Christian families. The pastor's kids, the missionary kids especially. She was a missionary kid. And she was the one who helped me to realize I really had to work through the trauma from my childhood. When I left home, I had tried to create a blank slate. I was going to stop my life and start over. I was going to recreate my whole identity from scratch because my childhood was so painful. And Birdie was the one, I didn't say her name, did I? Her name was Sheila Bird, and we called her Birdie. And Birdie was the one who helped me to realize you can't just start over. You really have to work through that trauma from your childhood. And I don't usually tell this part of the story, but I will for you guys. When I say I stumbled across L'Abri, it's because my family was passing through L'Abri. My father had been teaching in Turkey. It's called the Middle East Technical University. Anyway, and he was traveling through, and he was one of the first generation of sort of touristy Christians to stop at L'Abri and say, oh, let's see what this ministry is about. But the option, and then they wrote to me and said, come down here. So people sometimes ask me, why would you go to a Christian ministry if you were not a Christian? Well, I didn't go to L'Abri to go to L'Abri. I went to see my parents because I wasn't going to see them again. They were going back to the States. So that's how I ended up at L'Abri. But because of that, Birdie saw my father. Schaeffer used to have these Saturday night discussions. And so our family came to the Saturday night discussion. And Birdie saw my father. And she told me afterward, she hadn't talked to me yet, so she didn't know anything about him. she told me afterwards, I looked at your father and I thought, there is a man who oppresses everyone around him just by looking at him. So she knew that this was something we would need to talk about.
Wow.
She had a head start on knowing what we needed to talk about. And so really it was working with Bertie and getting emotional, psychological, spiritual healing through her knowledge, of psychological dynamics, but also just her love. She had a love that I had never experienced anything like that before. And so through Bertie, I got a sense of what it was like to be loved in that unconditional way. And of course, that's what set me up then to really experience God's love in a really deep, transformative way.
Wow. It's providence.
Listening to even, you elaborate on that story more, even more the background with your father. Thank you for sharing that. It makes me just so shocked and surprised that it would sound like you should be writing the book against toxic masculinity, but you're writing a book saying there's a toxic war against masculinity. So, it's like the record scratch, like, I'm going to write a book saying we need a proper sort of redeemed the way God designed it, basically. Can you give us sort of a bird's eye overview of what was your motivation in writing the book, and what's your overarching goal? If someone is going to read this, what is the book and what is it not?
Yeah, well, of course, my eye was caught by the fact that it's become incredibly socially acceptable to express hostility against men, even in respected publications. Like I saw an article in the Washington Post, and the title was, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a respected mainline publication, a Huffington Post editor tweeted, #kill all men. You can buy t-shirts that say, so many men, so little ammunition. And books are out there with titles very blunt, like I Hate Men, and No Good Men, and Are Men Necessary? And even men have jumped on the bandwagon. A fairly well-known male author wrote a book in which he said, talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer. And then this one you may have seen, it's not in the book because it came out more recently, but in the news, the director of the movie Avatar.
Yeah.
Did you see that one?
Yeah. James Cameron.
Testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. So no wonder one survey found that about 46% of American men, agree with the statement, these days society seems to punish men just for acting like men. And whether you agree or not, that's a lot of people who think that men are now getting, the bad end of the stick. And even in Christian circles, I teach at Houston Christian University. When I told my class I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us." Okay. So the starting point was a kind of an apologetics. You guys will understand this. You're on an apologetics website. It was an apologetics on, how can we give a critique of the secular view of masculinity? You can't stand against a social trend unless you ask, where did it come from? How did it develop? And so that was my first goal, was just to get to the bottom of where the secular definition of masculinity came from and how it has become so negative. That was the first step.
One of the claims that you make in the book is we often hear evangelical Christian men, they're patriarchs, they're prone to abuse, they oppress their wives. But you actually make the claim in your book that I was really interested to learn about, that when you test this out, or when you actually look at the statistics, the lowest level of abuse and divorce is among evangelicals. I also know there's an important distinction that needs to be made there. So can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, and this is the second answer to your question. The final reason I decided to write the book is as I began to research these subjects, I found out that academic sociologists, psychologists have been doing studies of Christian men, and they have been debunking the secular stereotype. So I start out with some of those accusations. They were very easy to find, a quick Google search. So I'll give you just one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So what happened is the social scientists were looking at these accusations and saying, well, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I quote some dozen or so different studies. And they all discovered, surprisingly, that they debunked the secular stereotypes, that in fact, evangelical Christian men who are deeply committed to their faith, who attend church regularly, test out as the most loving husbands and engaged fathers. And they do interview the wives separately, which is important. So that's saying that the wives report the highest level of happiness with their husband's love and affection. Evangelical fathers test out as the most engaged fathers. They spend 3.5 hours more per week than secular men, both in shared activities like church youth group and sports, and in discipline in terms of setting limits on screen time or enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples divorced at the lowest rate of any major group in America. And the real stunner is they do have the lowest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any major group in America. And when I ran across this, I was stunned. I was blown away because it's not out there in the public yet. I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this data. And I thought, okay, this is the final reason you've got to write this book. I want to get the good news out. I put it at the front of the book, right? Because I said, you start with the good news. You get people, happy about something before we get into the bad news, And so it's good for Christians, I think, because, even Christian churches can get negative toward men. I have a graduate student who's the head of the women's ministry at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so I thought, okay, stop scolding them. Take this data into the churches so you can encourage and support men who are doing a good job. And it's important for apologetics purposes, too. I think we also need to bring it into the public square to debunk the secular narrative, because this isn't just a pep talk from some religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings that Christianity does, in fact, have the power to reconcile the sexes, as I put it in my subtitle.
That's super helpful. One of the distinctions that I was thinking of that I feel like is just worth bringing out for our listeners, though, is that there is kind of that distinction, and you said it, you hinted at it, of we have these dedicated men who attend church, who actively participate in their faith. And then we see a drastic difference, though, between those types of men and men that we would call kind of nominal or Christian by name only. Can you talk a little bit about the differing data there?
Yeah, this was important. So the first pushback I always get is, but haven't we all heard that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And in fact, in my research, I found out that is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders.
Yeah, I was going to say, I've heard Christian leaders say that. Yeah.
Oh, yes. I think they're trying to, motivate you by negative motivation. But so the researchers went back to the data and they made that important distinction between committed Christian men and nominal Christian men. My students don't even know what nominal means. So NOM is Latin for name. So you were right. It means in name only.
Yeah.
And these men test out shockingly differently. They fit all of the toxic stereotypes. Wives report the lowest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America, higher than secular men. And so this is really stunning. The church, think of what the church has in terms of its task now, how to be more supportive to the men who are doing well. The data shows that. But how can they reach out to these men who are claiming an evangelical identity and, in a sense, ruining the reputation of evangelicals, but who are actually worse than secular men? I do get asked sometimes, well, why would they be worse than secular men? So the research, they're not quite sure, but they think it's because they feel religious justification. In other words, the secular guy who's out there hitting his wife and kids doesn't feel any special justification. But the nominal Christian thinks, well, God called me to be the boss. And, she wouldn't submit, so I had to put her in her place. And he feels religious justification. Essentially, he's taking biblical terms like headship and submission, but importing secular meanings into it, which ends up being actually worse than secular men. So that's the challenge before us. You can see why the statistics are always skewed. If you don't make that distinction, if you have just an umbrella study, you've got men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. So of course the numbers will be misleading. And that's why it was so important that they went back and made this distinction. So we know now what we're up against. We have a much better way, much better strategy for dealing with these two groups of men.
Yeah. And I would just want to say to listeners, Nancy does a great job in her book kind of unpacking how these Christian by name only type of men do take the scriptures and twist them and put a secular meaning on the text. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, I definitely encourage you to pick up the book.
So Nancy, how do we get from, there's good men, but there's toxic men. And it seemed to me that would be pretty consistent through history. You're going to have good ones and you're going to have bad ones. And now what's come to light is that even though there is toxic masculinity out there, why isn't there just a war on the toxic masculinity? Why is it turned into a toxic war against masculinity in general? What do you think is the shift there?
That's a good question.
Well, historically, a lot of people think the idea of toxic masculinity started with, 1960s, second wave feminism. But no, you have to go much further back. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked with their wives and children all day in the family industry, the family farm, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused much more on their caretaking role. In fact, this was an interesting historical fact. The literature on childrearing, books and sermons, advice manuals, were addressed to fathers. If you go to a bookstore today, they're almost all addressed to mothers. But back then they were addressed to fathers because fathers were seen as the primary parent. Even non-Christian historians will write things like this. The concept of masculine virtue back then was duty to God and man. That sounds very colonial, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the concept of authority was not you get whatever you want. It was who's responsible for the common good of the marriage, of the family, the church, whatever. And so there was a very strong sense that if you're an authority, you don't look out for your own interest. The favorite word at the time, in fact, was disinterested, meaning you don't look out for your interest because you're the one responsible for the interest of the whole. So how did we lose that incredibly rich concept of masculine virtue? The Industrial Revolution took work out of the home, and men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time in American history, they were not working with their families, with people they loved and had a moral bond with. They were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you see the literature start to change. People began to protest that men were losing the caretaking ethos that they'd had in the colonial era, that they were becoming individualistic, self-interested, egocentric, greedy, acquisitive. This is the language they used. Look out for number one, making their career an idol. You see that. I have several quotes from people saying, men are no longer focusing their identity on their family, but they're starting to make their career their idol. And it's also taking the place of religion because, in a sense, the Industrial Revolution created a large split between private and public realms because the public realm suddenly was full of these very large public institutions like factories, businesses, financial institutions, universities, and, of course, the state. And people began to argue that these public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your personal values, your private values into the public realm, which is what we hear today still. So in essence, the secular realm was being secularized. And because men were getting that secular college education, they were working in that secular realm, men were also becoming more secular, earlier than women did. And that affected their behavior. And again, in the literature of the day, you see it. They began to complain that men were not attending church as often. History books always talk about how there was a huge increase of what are sort of the traditionally masculine vices in the 19th century, like drinking, gambling, prostitution, crime, abortion, and so on. There was a huge increase of these behaviors, which is, of course, why there was also a huge increase of reform movements in the 19th century. But the point is that this 19th century then is the first time we see negative language describing the male character. And so that gives us new insight into how long it's been. And if it was caused by men being alienated from their families, it also tells us some hint of the solution. How can we reconnect men more closely to their families, and especially to their sons, because their sons will be the next generation of men. So I do have a whole chapter on sort of practical ways that we might be able to tweak the workplace and allow fathers to have more time with their children. So, you can't write about this without some solutions.
Yeah, it's like we've gone from, like, you think of like a man, like a Little House on the Prairie, Charles Ingalls. You think, okay, if that was the situation for sons and daughters growing up, I mean, they'd have this ultimate role model and care and protection and training. And now it's just like, oh, now that's Homer Simpson. He comes home and eats a donut, and it's a real different mindset now.
It is. I have a whole chapter on that, in fact, because, it's our advertising, it's our movies, it's animations, all are presenting, the father is the doofus dad, the bumbling idiot. One of my sons loved the Berenstain Bears. Have you ever read those?
Yes.
The father's always the stupid one. At any rate, why did that happen? We all know that happened, but why? Again, it's the Industrial Revolution. When fathers were taken out of the home, just like you said, Brian, they're no longer working alongside their children. And already in the 19th century, you see in the literature of the day, people start complaining that fathers have become superfluous. They become irrelevant. They become incompetent because they no longer are really in tune with the family dynamics. They're no longer aware of what their children are thinking and feeling. And so the idea of an incompetent father actually starts already in the 19th century. And again, the solution has to be, can we find ways to reconnect fathers with their children? And the pandemic actually had a small silver lining in that a lot of fathers found out they really like being home. Surveys have shown this. I have a survey in the book. 65% of fathers said they did not want to go back to the office full time, that they wanted some kind of a hybrid situation. And then this came out after the book, but the New York Times had an article with a wonderful title. The title was, "During the Pandemic, Fathers Got Closer to Their Children, and They Don't Want to Lose That." So even today, there are ways, and the pandemic has made it a lot more doable for many people. And we have to sell business and industry and corporations on it as well. So I do have quotes from CEOs in the book. One of them said, we were always hesitant to allow for remote work because, of course, we were afraid people would slough off. They wouldn't do their work. And he said the pandemic completely exploded that fear. We saw no drop in productivity. And another CEO, I quote, says, if you give parents time to be better parents, they are better workers. They actually, it's a win-win. They actually are better workers when they're better parents. So if you're in a corporation, you can take these quotes in and show your boss. It really is best for both families and for corporations for fathers to be, fully engaged fathers.
One thing your book says is that men are being torn between two competing scripts for masculinity. Can you unpack that?
Yeah, this was a really interesting study done by a sociologist, and I'll give you some background that's not in the book. This has been the most controversial book I've written, and that surprised me because my last book was Love Thy Body, which is on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, issues that are hot button issues right now. But in fact, this has been more controversial, at least in the Christian world. And in the manuscript phase, I taught it in classes. I led reading groups. I like to get lots of feedback, rub off the rough edges. And when they told their family and friends about it, invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone, whose side is she on? Males tended to think, since a female's writing this book, I'm probably some kind of male-bashing feminist. And progressive types tended to assume I was some kind of angry, defensive, reactionary culture warrior, fighting the culture war. And so I had to rewrite the first chapter multiple times to sort of get over that. By the way, the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So I put this study right at the front to show you don't have to be on one side or the other, right? And this study was done by a sociologist. He's not a Christian, but he speaks all around the world. And so he came up with this clever experiment where he would ask young men two questions. First, he would say, what does it mean if I say he was a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would immediately say things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible. And he'd say, where'd you learn that? And they would say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. Or if it was a Western country, they would say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with a second question. And he'd say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language. You know, in other words, the Andrew Tate model of masculinity, fast cars, fast money, fast women. And the sociologist concludes that it seems that all around the world, Christian or not, men have an innate, inherent sense of what it means to be a good man. As you and I would say, they're made in God's image, and they do know what it means to be a good man. Or Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. Or you could chalk it up to general revelation, right? General revelation is what we know because we're made in God's image and live in God's world, whereas the Bible is special revelation. Men seem to know what the good man is. They seem to know that their unique masculine strengths, because men are bigger, stronger, faster, more aggressive in general than women are, but their unique masculine strengths are not given them just to get what they want, but to protect, provide for, take care of, and if necessary, fight for the people that they love. But they also feel cultural pressure to be, quote unquote, the real man. And many cultures have that sort of real man script that men feel pressure to live up to, which are the more toxic traits, right? The things that, at least if they're decoupled from a moral ideal, can slide into entitlement, control, exploitation, and so on. And so this gives us a much better way to deal with these issues. Most men do not respond well to being accused of being toxic, right? You know, nobody would. So instead, is there a way for us to tap into that innate, inherent knowledge of what it means to be the good man? You know, they do aspire to be the good man. Can we tap into that, support it, encourage, affirm it? And that would give us a much more positive way of addressing these issues.
So we've got a couple of different scripts. If we're seeing more and more of a like a secular society, how do you think that contributes to the negative script for masculinity?
Yeah, in the book, I do go through several stages as the script for masculinity became more and more secular. One of my favorite ones to focus on is the rise of Darwinian evolution, because most of us are surprised by that. We think of Darwin as a matter of science and fossils, genes, but it had an enormous impact on views of masculinity. Darwinian thinkers began to say that the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would be the ones who were rugged, ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and sexually predatory. And so they began to say, this is the true masculine nature. This is the authentic self. Whereas Christianity urged men to live up to the image of God in them, Darwinian thinkers said, you need to get in touch with the beast within. That was their favorite phrase, the beast within. And Darwin himself actually argued that women are intellectually inferior to men. So if that's part of the toxic script, he bears some responsibility for that as well. But that idea, it's called social Darwinism then, it's not just historical. It's come back in a big way. It's called evolutionary psychology. And it's the same idea, right? If your body has evolved, so has your brain, so has all your feelings, all your emotions, your behavioral patterns. So I'll give you one example. There was a very famous book, well, it was a best-selling book, at least, called The Moral Animal. And the author says, the human male is an obsessive, oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving him a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving a Viking a book on how not to pillage. And I thought, really? This became a bestseller? A book that demeans men this way? And you may have seen this too. George Gilder's book has just been reissued. George Gilder wrote a book called Men in Marriage that has just been reissued. His is the same message. You know, men are violent, sexually predatory, irresponsible, and it's up to women to tame them. He adds that part, right? It's women's job to tame them. In fact, he goes so far as to say that men need to accept the woman's morality and that civilization is based on the woman's morality. To which I say, what man is going to say okay to that message? No, our message is, men, you live up to God's morality. it's not like I'm imposing. It's not like women are imposing something on you. I mean, that's the language of the manosphere today, right? That everything's been feminized and women control everything, and that they are asking, we're asking men to live up to rules that have been laid down by women. No, the Christian message is that God created men, and God has a plan, a design for what it means to be a godly man. Mm-hmm. So we're still up against that kind of evolutionary psychology even today. And it's a big part of the secular script of masculinity.
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and get your take on what the church may have tried to do to provide a sort of masculine input into the church. People will say, oh, well, the church is full of women. We need to draw men to the church. And so the things that they do to draw the men is like monster trucks and, tanks and Chuck Norris and that sort of thing. And, wild at heart, let's throw bales of hay around and do man things and barbecue. Those things may be associated with men in certain ways, but what has the church tried to do and maybe failed to do? Where's it maybe going off the rails or approaching it in the wrong way, if that makes sense?
Yeah, there is some problem with the fact that the Christian church has attracted more women than men from day one, by the way. Rodney Stark, who you probably know, sociologist of religion, mm-hmm. says even in the early church, there were more women than men. Why? Because women had so much more dignity and status in the church than they did in the surrounding Greco-Roman culture. Mm. Women had very low status in the Roman culture. Wives were for having legal heirs, but they did not expect intimacy or love between husband and wife. The husband, it was perfectly socially acceptable for a man to have sex with just about anything on two legs. Mistresses and prostitutes and courtesans, and most of all slaves. Most adultery was with a man's own slaves. And by the way, men and women, male and female slaves, children and adults. Child sex was also very popular at the time. So with that, the Christian church said, no, you can't do that, men. No, you can only have sex with your wife. So this had a huge impact on raising the status of women and of marriage. A man was told he had to bring all his erotic attention and focus on just one person. And the wife no longer had to compete. This was in my earlier book, Love Thy Body, but I quoted a Roman writer who was literally scolding a Roman wife, and saying, because she was jealous that her husband was having sex with the slave boys. And this Roman writer said, you shouldn't be jealous. You should know that sex with boys is more pleasurable, so just accept it. That was the mentality. So you see why women flocked to the early church. They had much more status. So this has been an issue from pretty much from day one. It became even more of an issue in America after the First and Second Great Awakenings, because there were not a lot of outright atheists at the time. And so the Awakenings did not really engage in much apologetics, reasoned approaches to Christianity. What they were doing was they were trying to arouse the emotions of nominal Christians. And so almost by default, the message tended to be very emotional, trying to rouse them to more commitment, higher level of enthusiasm. And so one of the takeaways from the First and Second Great Awakenings is they did a lot of good, but the negative baggage was they kind of redefined religion in terms of an intense emotional conversion experience. And since, of course, women were thought to be more emotional, that meant that religion was seen as more suited to women. So we have had this for a long time. And today, the average church in America is 60% women, 40% male. That's the average. So all that to say, I do think that there's some validity to saying, is there a way that we can state the message in a way that appeals more to men? And there was a movement in the early 20th century called muscular Christianity, and they tried to do it. They tried to change the language so that it was more appealing to men. They used militaristic language. Billy Sunday is the example. Who you probably know him. He was so colorful. Most Christians know him. He would challenge men and say, if you don't come down the sawdust trail and give your heart to Christ, it's because you're not man enough. You need to be man enough to be a Christian. It takes a true man to be a Christian. He had this very testosterone-laden style. And some of this, was good, because I do think that they were trying to counter the fact that Christianity had kind of taken a feminized tone. Unfortunately, they kind of went overboard with it. And just as the secular cultures, this was, at the same time that we just talked about social Darwinism. At the same time that social Darwinism as a secular movement was pulling women off their Victorian pedestal and putting them on a lower rung on the evolutionary ladder, some of the proponents of muscular Christianity began to argue that women are inferior, that men are the superior sex, and that women are weaker and spiritually and morally. And they began to shut down a lot of the avenues of ministry that had been allowed in the church up until that time. Up until that time, most churches did not ordain women, but they allowed women to speak from the pulpit, to be missionaries, to be heads of Christian schools, they didn't call them pastors, they called them exhorters. But, it was basically give a sermon. And the fundamentalists began to shut all that down, which, of course, gave rise then to evangelical feminism in the 40s and 50s. So the church has kind of gone back and forth on this. Here's where my message is in the book primarily. I do have trouble with the overdone masculinity of AR-15s in the as a raffle, as a raffle prize and big truck events and so on. But I take men back to the cultural mandate. I do this about 3 or 4 times in the book because I think we've overlooked how important it is. The cultural mandate, about half my students don't know what it even means. So it's in Genesis, God has created the universe. He creates the first human couple. And what does he say to them? He tells them why he created them. What's your job description? What's your purpose? It's to be fruitful and multiply and to subdue the earth. Be fruitful does not mean just the family, of course, because all of the social institutions historically grow out of the family. The extended family becomes a tribe, becomes a village, becomes a nation, and social institutions are formed, the church, the school, the state, the marketplace. So implicit, in the streamlined language of Genesis is to create all the social institutions. Subdue the earth means harness the natural resources. So, of course, most cultures start with agriculture, but then mining and technology and building homes and creating computers and composing music. And one of my students said, come on, composing music? So I play the violin, and I said, what's the violin made out of? What's the bow made out of? Horsehair. So all of the transcendent beauty that we associate with music starts with harnessing the raw materials of nature. And so I think when men are feeling like, well, what am I supposed to be doing? And they're being, some people are saying, like you said, wild at heart, the way to find your true identity is to get away from civilization, away from the family, and out there whitewater rafting and hunting elk with a bow. Nothing against nature. I love nature. I'm a camper. I love to camp. But it's the mentality of, do you find your true, authentic masculinity by getting away from the family and civilization? That was a big theme of the late 19th century, by the way. No, you find your true masculinity by rolling up your sleeves and embedding deeply in responsibilities, social responsibilities, and in creative and productive work. That's what the cultural mandate tells us.
Amen. Well, before we finish our time here, I would feel remiss if I didn't ask you about something that you bring out in the book, and that is that the church, in, I don't know if it's proper to say some cases, many cases, you would be able to speak to that, has often or too often failed women who are in abusive situations. They're often told that they need to submit more, they need to love more, they need to do more, and just love. If you love your husband enough, you can straighten him out. That kind of attitude, right? So if there is somebody listening who may be in a situation like that, how can the church do a better job of supporting a woman who actually genuinely is experiencing what we would call toxic masculinity in her house?
Yeah, because I do talk about nominal Christian men who have higher rates of domestic abuse than even the secular world. I did have to deal with that question, right? So I do have 2 chapters on abuse in Christian homes. And you are absolutely right. Up until very recently, the woman was always made responsible for fixing it. As if she, like you said, if she would just submit more, love more, pray more, forgive more, fix his favorite foods, that, as one woman put it, her pastor told her, he will blossom into the man you want him to be. Well, it's just not human nature. We kind of know that in other situations. When you're dealing with a bully, someone who is willing to hurt others to get what he wants, whether it's a playground bully or whether it's, a belligerent nation in international affairs, if you please placate them and try to appease them, It doesn't work. It's just not human nature. If you respond in kindness, they think that that's accepting. You're accepting their behavior. If you forgive them, they say, "Oh, she thinks it's okay." So fortunately, it has only been in the recent years, at most the past decade or so, that books have been coming out by Christian theologians and Christian therapists saying, no, the approach to outright abuse, when it's really sin, is what Jesus said in Matthew 18. Right?
Amen.
Jesus said, if there's actual sin, you confront it, you call it out. And if they don't respond, you bring a few witnesses. And if they still don't respond, you go to the whole church. And if they still don't respond, it might be time for some kind of church discipline. So fortunately, the books are now starting to say, we have to approach the sin. And often whoever is being abusive, and sadly, it usually is the man, just because, especially when it's physical, because men are bigger and stronger. Half of female homicides, half of all female murders are intimate partner violence. That's husband, former husband, boyfriend, former boyfriend. So it is a serious issue. It's also the main reason women end up in the hospital. So the church does need to take it very seriously, and it would be best for them to hire some specialist or have specialists on hand that they can refer to. It's far beyond the capability of most pastors just because they're not trained. And most pastors will see the sort of low-level conflict where actually loving more and forgiving more might be what you need, right? Mm-hmm. I think most of us do need that. So I didn't want to say, obviously, I don't want to say, get past that. You start with that. You start with loving, forgiving, understanding, giving a second chance, working it out. But there are the percentage, probably about 20% of conflicts where it is truly abusive. And that's where a pastor really needs to recognize when they need to get some outside help. Otherwise, they can expose the victim to more violence. I give the example of the biggest mistake pastors make is to bring the husband and wife into the office together because they think, oh, it's a marriage problem. Let's fix the marriage. But if there's true abuse, number one, the wife won't tell because she knows that when she walks out of that office, she's going to be punished. And I tell the story. This was a real story that a therapist related. He got the woman, he felt like the couple was ready to go there. So he got the woman to admit that her husband was being violent. And in the office, he was tearing up and acting repentant and sounded very broken. As soon as they got in the car, he grabbed his wife's hair and slammed her face into the dashboard multiple times, saying, I told you never to talk to anyone about that, except he used much more much fouler language. Mm-hmm. So he said, that was my lesson. This therapist, he's not a Christian, but this therapist said, I said, that was my wake-up call. You never bring them in the office together if there's any hint that there might be abuse, because you open the victim to greater abuse. So strategies like that the church has not been aware of. Fortunately, there are more and more therapists out there. If you are in a situation like that, read my endnotes. I got all the best resources on the subject, both secular and Christian. And so I really put my heart and soul into those two chapters. So there's really good resources there.
That's good.
Well, Nancy, it's been a really enjoyable interview, and we've really appreciated your book and the time you've given us today. We want to point people to your website, which is nancypearcey.com. And we want to point people to where they can get the book. They can obviously go to Amazon and those sorts of links. Are there any other resources you'd want to point our listeners to today? I
should tell you that Pearcey is Pearcey, because people who look up nancypearcey.com don't always find it. So that's the only thing. And my publisher very generously helped me to redesign it so it's fun and colorful, and you can come and browse my other books as well. And you can leave a message. I don't get a chance to answer all of them, but I read them all. So come on by nancypearcey.com and say hello.
Super. Well, definitely check those things out, and we'll link to those in the show notes so you don't have to spell it right. So just give it a click. Nancy, thank you so much for your time and for all your hard work.
Yes, thank
you. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful talking to both of you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Oughton and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.